Welcome back to the channel. Today we'll be making a sunglasses hanger or a sunglasses shelf. As for what you'll need for this project, I used a 1/4 inch plywood just because it's what I had on hand. You're going to cut 9 pieces that are the shelf bottoms, and those will be about 6 9/16, which is just a hair over 6.5 inches, by 2 5/16 inches, which is just over 2 1/4 inches. I also used a 1x4 board. If you don't have the wood on hand, a 1x4 board, 1 is all you will need. You'll need 2 pieces that are 2 5/8 inches by about 22 3/4 inches. Those are going to be the 2 side pieces. There will be a lot of little notches in those. You're going to trim that 3.5 inch width down to the 2 5/8 using a table saw. You're not going to need the full 3.5 inch width. You can use it if you want to, but I think it'll make the shelves a little bit too deep for my personal taste. What I actually used for those instead is I had a 1x6 that you'll see me cut in half, and then you'll need 9 pieces that are about 9/16 inches by 7.5 inches, but still retain that 3/4 inch width. So I'll add that in right now just to remove any confusion. You want to retain that 3/4 inch width. You have about a 9/16 by 7.5 inch piece. You'll need a 22 3/4 by 6.5 inch piece. That's actually going to be the backing panel. And for these two, right here and right here, where we're asking for 9 pieces each, I would actually cut more than you need. I'd cut anywhere between 10 and 15 of them, depending on how experienced you are, especially for these 1x4s. We're going to be notching these in a number of different ways, and there is a risk that you could chew through a few when you're trying to get this completed. I actually ruined about 2 or 3 of these, so fortunately I did have enough extra on hand. If you think you're really good, maybe you'll only do 9, but I think for the average person, it's just a safer thing and will save you a lot of time if you just cut the extra ones up front. The other things that I used are brad nails in a few different lengths. I used some wood glue, and I used a hanger kit to put a wire on the back so I could hang this thing on the wall. Now, like I said, you are going to be notching these 1x4 pieces. I don't have the exact dimensions, but I'll show you what I mean when I'm talking about this. Now, needless to say, I am filming this after the fact. This is obviously completed already, but the notches that we're putting in these side 1x4 boards are going to have these little shelf bottoms sit in them. The other thing we're doing is notching the back corner of this 1x4 so that the back panel can sit flush against it without seeing the trim here in the corner the whole way around. And these 1x4s here that I have at 9/16 width, we're going to notch these corners so that it flushes out on this end panel really well. And we're also going to notch the back of them so that shelf can sit in the back of these and support them. Now, I don't have the exact dimensions of every single notch location, but coming down here, these have just over 1/8 of an inch. It's about 3/16 of an inch between the top of this board and the top of this front trim piece. All of them have that little height difference between the actual shelf and the trim piece in front. Just gives it a little lip to catch on and makes it sit in there a bit nicer. Now, the tops of these trim pieces and the tops of the notches as a result are all 2 3/4 inches apart. This top one up here and this bottom one, we also notch the bottom of these sides so that these can just get nailed straight in on the bottom, and then I would solve up from there. Keep adding the 2 3/4 inches. That's where you're going to start your next one, your next one, your next one, and so on. And again, it's 2 3/4 inches from the start of one to the start of the other. It's not 2 3/4 inches between them. If you want to do that, you can do that to have your shelves a little bit higher. But when I was playing around with the design of these things, I tried a number of different combinations that I sketched out, and the height gets really out of hand very quickly if you add any more height to these shelves. So you can add more height, but my hands are pretty big and I don't really have an issue getting in and out of here for any of these sunglasses. So this is what we're going for. Now let's actually get to it. I start by cutting to length the board that will become the 2 side boards for the shelf. I then set up my newly acquired table saw and I start to cut the boards that will become the shelf bottoms. Now, I clearly don't have a runoff table or surface here, so it's a little bit sketchy cutting this full sheet of plywood, so I'm deliberately cutting these too wide. Then I'm going to go back and trim up the edges to make them the correct width. I then use the miter saw to cut a length that's more reasonable to work with out of this plywood strip. Then I go back to the table saw, cut 1 shelf bottom, test fit it with some sunglasses, and then continue to cut the rest until I have enough for this project. And like I said earlier, I made sure I had plenty of extras. I then adjust the table saw and cut the 2 sideboards to the correct width. Next, we'll be notching these sideboards. So I set the depth of the table saw to about 1/4 inch. That way it's the same height as the plywood backer we're putting on, and the plywood backer will sit flush in the pocket in the back side of these boards. Back of the miter saw, I cut 2 7.5 inch length boards out of the 1x4, and these are going to become our front trim pieces for the shelves. Prior to cutting down the 1x4s into those front trim pieces on the table saw, I first try to notch the sideboards so that the shelves can sit fit into, and this will help me with dry fitting everything so I can do it all at once. Now a dado blade would be the best way to do this. Dado spelled D-A-D-O, but I do not have one of those because I just picked the saw up. So instead I have to slightly adjust the saw blade and take multiple passes for each notch, and I'm hoping the shelf will sit into it tightly. As you can see in the still frame, the fitment's just a little bit too tight, so I gotta go back and widen these channels just a bit. With the shelf slots resolved, I go back with those 7.5-inch boards from the 1x4 and I strip those down so that they're about 9/16 wide, and those are going to become our front trim pieces later on. Now the way to notch these boards is going to be the same for all, but I'm only going to show it on the first two in the interest of time. I set the table saw depth to about 1/4 inch again, and then I notch the back of these trim pieces, that way the shelf has somewhere to sit. Next I turn the pieces sideways with the depth at the same setting, and then do a cut about 1/2 inch in on each side to notch the corners. I double the blade height and cut end on to finish the notches, and then dry fit the whole thing. I then go back and finish the rest, and again, you want more pieces than you'll actually need in the finished product. Next I go back and I retrim the shelf heights because I actually cut them a different size than what I used in my final product when I was initially doing this. With all the pieces cut, I take out the orbital sander and I start sanding everything. Now there's a lot of small pieces and there's a lot of edges and corners on these, so make sure you take your time and you actually get all of them. Because all these shelves are somewhat narrow, you're going to have a reasonable amount of time touching pretty much every surface, so you want to do a good job sanding. After making sure all the edges are sanded and all the corners are rounded off, I move everything inside to get it ready for staining. I start by cleaning everything with paint thinner, and then I'll move on to the actual staining process. I don't want to show the full cleaning and staining process just because of the length of time that's going to be required for all these pieces. So instead what I'll do is I'll release a separate video with the full time lapse of the build, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. The only noteworthy thing about staining that I don't mention in the staining video is that to really get in the corners of some of those nooks and crannies, sometimes it's helpful to take a flat edge screwdriver like you see me using here and really press the staining cloth into those corners to help it get in. The sheer number of pieces involved does make this process deceptively time consuming and a little bit more difficult than it may seem at first, but again, just take your time and don't be too worried about it. Once the stain's dried, you're ready to start assembling the finished product. I started by applying a bead of wood glue to the back notch for one of the two sideboards and then fitted the back panel into place. After figuring out the best way to hold this in place and making sure it was squared up, I then tacked it into place onto the sideboard, made sure everything was perfectly square, and then went down and secured it along the whole length. I used a clean Q-tip to clean up any excess wood glue, and then I repeated this process for the second side. As you can tell, this side went a lot smoother because, as I said, I already figured out how to do it using the first side. With the two sideboards installed, I then dry fit one of the shelves really quickly, then glued it on 3 sides and put it into the rest of the assembly. If all 3 sides aren't sitting perfectly flush against the surrounds here, don't worry about it too much. When we tack on the very top and the very bottom shelf, that's when you're going to have to make sure the shelves are squared off to the sideboards. It's a little out of frame here, but I really clamped the sideboards together as much as I could. That way the shelves were nice and supported and tight on each side when I tacked in the very top and the very bottom shelves. I once again clean up all excess glue using clean Q-tips, and then I glue and tack on the front trim pieces for all of the shelves. With the front trim tacked in place and a final wipe of all the excess glue, the shelves are now complete.
The shelf is now complete. I'm pretty happy for the most part with how it came out. There's a few small gaps at some of the edges that I'm not thrilled about, but they're not bad enough that it's worth redoing. Coming up into the closet, this is the space I originally had this planned for, and it actually fits just about perfectly. So that said, let's get a hanger on the back of this and let's get it in the wall. So to hang this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a mount in the back of each of the 1x4s that were on the edge, and I'm going to run a wire between them, then put a picture frame hanger. And I was a little worried about the profile of this, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bend it in so it doesn't stick out as much, and then that way the back won't be too angled, or at least won't be angled enough that it's noticeable and annoys me.
Just as I said I'd do, I'm taking one of the eye loops and putting them on each of the 1x4s in the back, and then I'm putting a safety wire between the two and wrapping it around the end so it doesn't fall off. The wire is going to hang over a picture frame hanger that is bent in to have a lower profile, and then we're ready to load all our sunglasses onto the shelf.
And with that, sunglasses hanger is complete. That's all I got for this episode. Thanks for watching.